Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Women in Cleantech and Sustainability, ESG Reporting, Accelerating Transparency and Process. We will jump right in and get started with some basic introductions, and I will introduce our fabulous moderator this evening, who will in turn introduce our wonderful three panelists. So to get started, a little bit of our agenda preview here. We will take us through about a couple of minutes of introductions, and then most of our time will be spent with the panelists. We will address some questions and answers from you, the audience. We may pepper our speaking with some questions that come through the chat. So please do use the chat to pose any questions that you have. We will have volunteers with Women in Cleantech and Sustainability monitoring that chat window. So please do pose your questions there. And then we'll have a little bit of thank you and wrap up at the very end. As you can see with the chat, please do feel free to add your information like your name, your LinkedIn, where you're from, why you're joining. We'd love to learn more about each and every one of you. Here's some standard Zoom etiquette and virtual networking tips that we like to share at the beginning of each of our events. It's pretty standard Zoom etiquette that we all pretty much know by now, but just remember to mute and unmute yourself appropriately. Share your video if you can. We'd love to see your face, or at least add a picture to your Zoom account. And then write your full name so people can connect with you via LinkedIn. And of course, like I mentioned, share your LinkedIn profile in the chat. As a friendly reminder, just be respectful of each other and observe the best of intentions, be present and an active listener, and take away any insights and leave the judgments behind. Women in Cleantech and Sustainability is a network of professionals. We are here to advance the role of women and men in the green economy. We are very event driven. We have monthly events, at least monthly, virtually. We host a few in person, and we're getting more and more programmed for in-person events in 2023. We have, among many other benefits, an annual mentorship program. And one of our highlights is our TED Talk style event, WCS Talks, which we just hosted in Sunnyvale, California in October. Some upcoming WCS events to put on your calendar. December 1st, the LA chapter is hosting a book club. December 15th, we're going to have a holiday happy hour event. Some of it may be virtual, some of it may be in person. So put that on your calendar, wait for everyone to know where you are. And in spring, we will be launching our Entrepreneur e-Circle. So keep your eyes out for announcements and information on that. Of course, membership is a great way to engage with Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. Grab your cameras, or at least grab a screenshot of the code that you can scan, and you will, if you paid for a ticket, that ticket price will be included in your membership. And of course, going forward, virtual events are complimentary with your membership. And there are, as you can see, many other fabulous benefits to joining Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. So here comes the good stuff. Today's moderator is Amanda Pinion. I've had the really wonderful pleasure of working with her over the past year. We're just delighted that she is moderating for us tonight. She is the Associate Director at Antithesis Group. And with that, we'll get right down to it, handing it over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Julie. Hi, everyone. Great to meet you all. My name is Amanda Pinion. Like Julie had mentioned, I'm an associate director at Antithesis, which is a sustainability-only consulting firm, and I run our North American communications practice. So on one hand, We do annual ESG reporting for clients, and then on the other, we really drive the creative communications and messaging into brand purpose and brand equity. So, as some of you may have remembered, we did host a ESG reporting event last year with Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. There was a huge appetite to continue the conversation. So last year's event was focused on, basic ESG reporting, avoiding early pitfalls, and how an ESG report can drive organizational and cultural change. And since then, there's been many emerging trends, regulations, stakeholder expectations, and it's accelerated the timeline for when organizations should be producing transparent communications regarding their sustainability risks and opportunities. So today, we're going to focus on some additional details of what you need to do to get started on an ESG report, or how to build out an existing ESG report to stay up to date and prepare for new requirements. So with that, I would love to introduce our amazing panel we have today. First up, we have Karen Drozdiak, who is the head of ESG and sustainability at First Solar, which is the largest solar manufacturer in the US. She's based out of Washington, D.C., and has been in the solar photovoltaic, also known as PV, industry since 2011. She specializes in corporate sustainability communications and strategy, perfect for this panel discussion, ESG reporting, sustainability leadership standards, market research, crisis communications, employee engagement, responsible supply chain initiatives, and PV end-of-life management and recycling policy. She holds a BA in History and U.S. Foreign Policy from Columbia University and an MA in International Relations and Diplomacy from the Anglo-American University in Prague. So Karen, thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to pick your brain. Next up, we have Lauren Bromfield, who I am very excited to say I get to work with on a day-to-day basis. Lauren is an associate director at Anthesis with me, a key account manager for many of our really, really complex clients that we have. And she works kind of jointly between the ESG strategy team and communications practice. She's based out of Ontario and has worked in sustainability consulting for over 12 years, working with a really broad range of Fortune 500 organizations across a variety of sectors, enhancing their sustainability programs across operations, product, and supply chain. And she specializes in materiality, climate risk assessment, goal setting, including science-based targets, product stewardship, and ESG reporting and communications, and utilizes the handful of frameworks and indices such as GRI, CDP, TCFD, SASB, DJSI, the alphabet soup of what reporting and communications for ESG is. And lastly, we have Hasitha Sridharan, who is the North American sales lead for Greenly, which is a carbon management accounting platform. She is also located out of Ontario, and she comes to us with 8 years of management consulting experience. And with a data-first mindset, she seeks to help clients baseline their carbon footprint and determine a decarbonization strategy that contributes to larger strategic goal setting, operational efficiency, and business growth. She's successfully implemented strategic, large-scale, and complex transformations at Fortune 500 companies as well. And she's an alumna of the University of Windsor and Tulane University, where she's completed a bachelor and a master's respectively in finance, and holds a certificate in sustainable business strategy from HBS. So very excited to have these three amazing women as a part of this conversation, bringing in different perspectives into ESG reporting. And as we jump into the questions, please, panelists, feel free to provide any additional context about your role and your experience with ESG transparency. And like Julie had mentioned, we'd love to hear from the audience throughout. Feel free to pop questions into the chat. We'll save some time at the end for anyone that wants to speak up and ask questions directly. But with that, I'm going to jump into some of the questions that we've prepared for today, and very excited to see where this conversation heads. So with that, I would love to ask each of the panelists, why should ESG reporting be adopted swiftly by organizations that have not yet started? Again, I mentioned, there's a lot of different stakeholder expectations and regulations happening. So would love to pick the brain of each of the panelists of what you've experienced and why we need to accelerate transparency now.
I'm happy to jump in. So hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Bromfield. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Amanda. I'm super excited to be here. This is my first Women in Cleantech event. So I would say that ESG reporting needs to be adopted swiftly because the business landscape is changing, and it's changing quickly. So organizations really need to adapt. And I think there are a couple of things I would highlight here. So one, ESG reporting creates transparency, which increases trust with stakeholders. And these days, it can also really help to attract investors and financing. There's a consensus that we've reached a tipping point, and ESG reporting has now basically become a mainstream expectation. I've been doing this reporting work for a long time now, and it used to be more on the voluntary side where companies were doing it to demonstrate leadership, gain a competitive advantage, and that's still a driver, but the reality now is that demand for enhanced transparency on environmental, social, and governance topics has reached unprecedented levels in the last few years. So in the corporate world in particular, this is being driven by investors, but all stakeholders are putting pressure on organizations. The younger generation of employees, they want to work for responsible companies. They want their work to have meaning. So ESG reports are increasingly being used in efforts to attract and retain talent, which is increasingly important in a tight labor market right now. Companies are expected to manage their risks and impacts outside their gates. So often customers will be increasingly requesting more and more information from their suppliers. And if you have a publicly available ESG report, it just makes it so much easier to respond to all those requests. And your responses are very credible because, you know, the report has been through a rigorous process to make sure the information is accurate. It's been signed off by legal and senior management. So that's like the first reason I would say is meeting increased stakeholder expectations for transparency. The second one, which is a lot more important now, is that many governments around the world are moving to mandate ESG disclosure for companies and financial institutions. So as many of you may know, there's been draft regulatory proposals popping up all over the world. There's the US SEC with their climate disclosure rule, amongst others. The European Union has their corporate sustainability reporting directive. The UK has been mandating TCFD disclosure by all large companies, and a lot of other countries are developing their own legislation. So over the next few years, ESG reporting is going to move more towards being a required compliance activity. And it's really important that if you haven't started, you prepare now, because in my experience, it takes a few years of reporting to set up good data collection and reporting processes, really kind of get to know and understand that alphabet soup of ESG standards and regulatory requirements that Amanda was talking about, and kind of iron out all the kinks. And then the last thing I'll say is if you're committed to sustainability, ESG reporting is a really great tool to kind of develop and refine your strategy and drive accountability. You can't easily produce an ESG report if you haven't already done some good internal work and you have something to say about your strategy, goals, and programs. So once companies have made public commitments to taking action, they're typically very motivated to demonstrate improvement year over year, show some positive impact that's backed up by evidence. So the annual reporting process is really important for motivating people, including those that, you know, in your organization that might not care about ESG, but, oh, we have this annual report we have to publish, and driving that progress.
Just jumping off what Lauren is saying, I think, you know, to her point, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And whether, you know, it's any of those drivers can determine that timing for companies. However, I'd say, you know, putting a strategy and operations lens on this, really, it's going to become more and more important for companies to have an ESG strategy, not just a reporting framework, but understand what they're going to do to disclose their emissions, decarbonize their supply chain. And we're seeing a lot of pressure, not just for public companies who have to, adhere to these regulations, but from larger suppliers. For example, Toyota just asked all of their suppliers to report their emissions. The federal government just asked all of their suppliers last week to not only disclose their emissions, but set science-based targets to get to net zero by 2050. So all of this is going to start making the competitive advantage more and more important when you disclose. And so it's better to do it now, have a few years before regulation and supply chain pressure hits you, and get it right. And that way you're really setting up your organization for success.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with my two panelists. I mean, ESG is now mainstream. When I was starting out in the ESG reporting world 10 years ago, I attended an ESG or sustainability reporting conference. And one of the first things they said is, first thing for you to recognize is nobody's going to read your report. So that was completely demoralizing. Now, investors are proactively asking us, when are you going to publish your report? When's it coming out? My CEO gets on my case, like, when is our report coming out? And he says internally, it's the single most important report that we publish every year, because it explains, what our culture is about at First Solar. And our latest report is all about our approach to responsible solar, which is how we've defined ESG within our company. And we view ESG as a way of minimizing risk, but also creating value, and it helps us differentiate ourselves. And by getting that data out into our sustainability report, it's being leveraged by ESG rating agencies that rate us, and investors leverage that data to determine which companies they want to invest in. So highly recommend ESG reporting if you haven't started yet.
Thank you. That was I think a great summation of the rationale behind why ESG transparency is so important. And I love that each of you touched upon developing strategy as well. Excuse me. So I know we touched among emerging trends, regulations. Curious how these regulations, this advancement of what's required of you has affected your organization, your business, and also just want to touch upon for the audience that public and private companies are held to different standards at this moment in time. If any of the panelists want to touch on that as well, that would be great, but would love to kind of dive in a little bit deeper around how regulations and emerging trends are affecting you and your ESG organization specifically.
I might.
Oh, go ahead, Karen.
I'll quickly jump in and just say, it's something we're tracking closely, because it will determine what we need to include in our sustainability report. We've been leveraging the Global Reporting Initiative as a framework for our sustainability report, and that was because we wanted to take all our stakeholders into account, not just investors, even though investors are very important. So figuring out which framework you want to use for your sustainability report is key. And now with the mandatory regulations, their governments and regions are stipulating what we need to include in those reports and how to report it.
I can talk about this from my perspective, which is servicing the need for data collection and calculation of GHG emissions as part of ESG reporting. And what we're seeing is, there is a lot of good intention amongst companies to want to understand their impact on the climate, adhere to regulation or pressure, or even consumer awareness, reacting to that. And I think the biggest barrier we see in the questions we get asked is, where do I start? And a lot of that has to do with ESG has always sat somewhat separate from business operations. It's been kind of sitting in HR or marketing or somewhere else, and hasn't been part of this annual disclosure process that accounting goes through, that most companies have to adhere to. And so what we're doing is really layering carbon accounting on top of these operational technologies and processes. And so that really, I think, helps shift the mindset of, this is an additional activity I need to do, to this is part of my regular process in which I tell my investors, I tell my shareholders, I tell my customers what I do and how we operate. And so it's really, I think, the investment we're seeing in global climate tech is to enable that further and make that easy for companies. And every day, whether it's big or small, we see customers coming to us with that need.
I would just add that because of all the emerging ESG disclosure regulations that are popping up around the world, one thing I'm really feeling is increased scrutiny by internal audit and compliance departments. They're driving the need for really solid documentation and assurance of ESG information, just to make sure that information that's reported is accurate and verifiable, but also consistent across all the different places where you might be reporting the information. And a lot of companies are in the midst of evaluating more sophisticated software systems to manage the data and enable that verified auditability, I should say, of the data. So that feels like a big change to me this year.
So I think I heard from each of you certain pieces about processes and data management, and I would love to dive into that a bit more from each of your very unique perspectives. And when we're talking about increased scrutiny of data management, can we dive into that a little bit deeper and see how that is evolving? And then also, for those of you that are putting together an ESG report or involved in an ESG report compilation, can we talk about the process of what that looks like actually, developing a report, whether it's your first time or you do it on an annual basis? I think that would be helpful for the audience as well.
I can definitely talk to that first half of that question. Really what we're seeing more and more is carbon accounting is not actually that complex. It's a simple multiplication of what are you spending or what are you doing? What is the emission of that activity? And then it's a multiplication. But where I think companies have seen a lack of ability is that's a very heavy load to take on from a manual perspective. So we've seen companies, gather their energy data, gather, their travel data, the aspects that they can potentially access a little bit easier. But to get an overall footprint to date has been fairly difficult. And that's the market need that, drove, Greenly to exist, particularly when it comes to, medium-sized businesses that don't necessarily have the capital to be spending on really intensive ESG reporting, really intensive carbon disclosures. What we're able to do is take, basic accounting data, basic data from, your e-commerce like Shopify or your cloud computing, Amazon, existing tech stack, understand those metrics, and then convert those into carbon. And so that's really, I think, when we see the investments going into the ESG space from a technology perspective, that's really the big focus is automation of this data management. And it's one of those ideas where if you're really looking at it from a ops perspective, it's important to get your accounting teams, your finance teams, the teams that are used to working with this data involved in this ESG reporting process, and not, again, keep it separate and keep it as a marketing idea, which I think to date has been more of the driver within organizations.
I can.
Yeah. Sorry, Lauren, you go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and talk to the second part. And just really at a high level, but I would describe a typical ESG report development process as kind of having like 4 phases. So the first is the planning phase. So just really thinking through, your reporting objectives, who are your target audiences, what's the high level messaging and narrative you want to get across, developing that structure of the report, your table of contents, which really should align with your material topic areas and strategy. There's a pretty big effort given the alphabet soup of standards to gather all of your reporting requirements, including, looking at all of the ESG reporting standards and disclosures and emerging regulatory disclosures. And then the second phase, I would say, is to get into the data and information gathering. So, reaching out to a number of stakeholders across the business. I think I worked on a report last year that there was 60 subject matter experts or content owners that were providing data. So it can be a big process depending on how large the company is, to just get all the information, make sure that it's validated and signed off across the business, conduct interviews with all those folks to make sure you're getting the key messaging right. And then the third phase is all of the report development. So lots of copywriting, rounds of editorial reviews, sending to a design team for layout. And I always think this takes way longer than it should, but the final reviews as the fourth phase. So typically, all the content owners who know the information well should review and sign off, usually the head of communications, senior management, sometimes the board, internal audit, legal, the design, if there's an internal design team or design lead. So lots of people often need to kind of review and sign off, and then you can go live and publish.
Yeah, no, that was an excellent overview. I think on our side, we're definitely looking at data automation, and it's something that I was literally just talking to our IT team about, and it's something we're going to be working on because we've been living in the spreadsheet world for the past 2 years, developing our sustainability report. And I think the need for automation is really the fact that these reports are going to have to come out earlier in the year. They're going to have to get verified earlier in the year. And so you need that data much sooner than you can with just spreadsheets. And so Lauren highlighted, the steps for creating your first sustainability report. I might zone in on the materiality assessment, because I think that step is really key to determining what you will be including in your sustainability report to begin with. And, start by looking at what your peers are reporting, what topics matter in your industry. We have a sustainability leadership standard that includes corporate sustainability reporting criteria that were developed through a multi-stakeholder process with NGOs, investors, other manufacturers, the scientific community. And we all managed to identify which topics are most relevant to the PV industry. And so we leveraged that as part of our materiality assessment. I think a game changer for us was 2 years ago, we worked with a third-party consultant to do a refreshed materiality assessment, and had conversations with our investors, with our customers, to understand, what topics mattered to them. Because when you're talking about materiality, it's not just what matters to your organization, it's also what matters to your stakeholders. What areas is your organization either positively or negatively impacting society or the environment, and ensuring that you're including that in your sustainability report. And then, the next important step is figuring out what framework you want to use. And with the draining of the alphabet soup, we're going to have fewer frameworks to choose from. But I think we'll still end up with a few.
Thank you, everyone, for that helpful context. I know we've talked about complex processes and, sometimes 60 plus stakeholders being engaged, and probably stakeholders have a different level of understanding of what ESG and what transparency means. And I'm curious, for each of you in your experience, what are typical questions that come through from stakeholders that you're engaging with, more so during the reporting or the communications phase rather than materiality? Materiality is a great way, I think, to engage with stakeholders to, again, define what you should be speaking about. But once you get that and you determine what you should be transparent, what is it usually kickback in nerves of being transparent, overly transparent, or do you just have, kind of general questions about what the purpose and the value of ESG reporting is? I think we've all probably dealt with a different range of stakeholder engagement. So curious kind of what the trends of questions are for each of you.
So starting out, many years ago, the main question I was getting was, why are we doing this? Do we need to do it? It's a lot of work. And at the time, like when we were first starting, it was really, the sustainability team wanting to put out a first report, be transparent. And then we started seeing customers, including in their RFPs, asking questions about whether you have an annual sustainability report. And then we started getting, mainstream investors asking about, what framework are you using for your sustainability report? Are you also reporting to SASB? So I think, that was kind of the natural evolution and the key questions that we got when we were starting out.
I don't have a lot to add to that other, I think it's just taking people on the journey, because a lot of contributors to an ESG report are not sustainability experts. Over time, as you develop annual reports, and they're often involved, they'll build up that knowledge and expertise. But yeah, it's really understanding the why are we doing this, who's asking for the information, and then show me the disclosure. Is what I'm providing you meet all the requirements of all the different stakeholders, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and since I'm more on the front end of that process of what goes into that reporting, I think a lot of what I get asked is, how do I know this data is right? How do I know it's accurate? How do I, this is going into the public eye, and I don't want to be called out on greenwashing. I don't want to be called out for, inaccurate data. And I think this is where using the data frameworks that already exist within companies, the data processes that already exist that are pretty, mature, and leveraging those to really come up with your carbon assessment, your materiality, like Karen was saying earlier. I think that gives a lot of confidence to customers and clients when they go into the reporting process itself.
Thank you. Great to hear perspectives of both someone who's, running an ESG reporting process, and then also someone who's participating. And again, I think a theme that I'm hearing throughout this conversation is data accuracy and validation of what's being reported and transparent. And I know greenwashing, and on the flip side, green hushing is now a conversation that's coming up constantly of, what's the right balance of the information that you're transparent about? How are you making sure that the information that you're putting in your report is as accurate as possible? And so I think the last question before we jump to some of the audience questions, I've seen a couple really good ones come in through the chat. Looking back, so when you first were involved in your first ESG report, whether it was someone who was participating in putting it together or someone who was managing the program, what is something that you would do differently? I'm sure we've all been there where we're like, oh, we could have done that completely different. The first one's always the roughest. And then slowly you work and figure out what best practices are. And I'm curious, just from lessons learned from each of you, of what would you do differently, and what would you recommend for people who might be putting out their first report?
So, I mean, for me, I would say having that data automation in place would have been great. But I'm also aware that back in the day, the software was not as great as it is starting to get now. So.
Yeah, I mean, I echo Karen's sentiment there that I wish that, these tools had existed, but two, it would have been great to just reach out for external help. I think there are now just a pool of experts that really know what they're doing. And so not hesitating to use external resources rather than trying to take on the burden internally.
I would say two things. So one is sometimes we get requests to develop an ESG report before those internal strategy programs, goals are in place. And sometimes we do it and we do the best we can, but in hindsight, we think, maybe actually you want to take a year to build up your internal capacity and strategy and programs, and then get into ESG reporting. So I think that's one thing. And then The other is just getting back to the materiality point that Karen made. So if you're a first-time reporter, I would say don't try to tackle all the standards and check every disclosure box all at once. It's a little bit overwhelming. And so prioritizing is going to be your friend. Focus on your most material topic areas, put your time and effort into really concisely and clearly articulating what your strategy and goals are for the most important topic areas. And then over time, you can just build out the information.
Thanks, everyone. And just to add my own sentiment in here so the audience knows a lesson of my own that I've learned, I think it's really imperative to socialize the rationale behind why you're becoming more transparent for your organization. Again, you have different stakeholders that have a different level of understanding of what ESG transparency means and the value that it brings to your organization. And there are many times that you encounter people that are hesitant to disclose or be transparent. And I think the earlier that you can engage with everyone and bring them up to speed of what the rationale is, the easier the process will be, and also the more excited people will get for understanding, you know, again, the value that it brings to your organization. So for me personally, I just like to focus on trying to make sure it's a positive experience for everyone involved, because at the end of the day, we might be asking people to do a little bit more of their day-to-day job than they originally signed up for. And, you know, there's nothing ever wrong with trying to make a positive experience for people, but I completely agree with all these sentiments shared here. Really enjoyed picking each of your brains. Again, I've seen some good conversation come through the chat, and maybe now would be a good time to start asking some of those questions to our panelists. Do you want me to read them out? Or is someone else from the WCS panel going to do it? I'm happy to.
Yes, hi. So we had a question from Erika. Are there specific sectors where you see ESG is really taking off? She works in healthcare, and it feels like industry is still trying to figure out what its approach is.
I would say there are definitely some early movers. You know, the consumer brands were probably the most evolved in their sustainability reporting process, but you know, more and more you're seeing other industries, and now, you know, the clean tech industry, PV industry is really starting to publish more and more sustainability reports. So I would say it's across the board.
Yeah, I would agree that it is across the board. Some of the newer kind of areas that I'm seeing is definitely in the finance space. I think there is more and more from an asset manager or, you know, financial institution perspective, both from a risk perspective, but also regulation. We're seeing a little bit more movement in that space. Tech, I think there is a lot of, you know, in the tech industry, there is just a little bit more ask from their employees, from their investors to be more climate conscious and start being a little more transparent around that. So another piece where I think we're seeing a little bit more of a boom. When it comes to healthcare, I definitely think it's a little bit less mature. That being said, we are seeing more and more pharmaceutical companies start to understand what their emissions profile looks like. How can they, you know, there is a lot of scrutiny around their operations. So how can they use ESG to potentially increase their, you know, brand health? And so definitely it's starting in that space as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. We had another question from Enka. She was asking if you see a benefit in using different frameworks compared to using a specific one when creating a report.
So there's a difference between now and what it will be, I think, in a few years. Because there are quite a few different ESG reporting standards and frameworks that are currently in use. it's made the reporting process confusing to a lot of people, and there's inconsistent reporting. So there's a lot of effort underway at the moment to globally standardize ESG frameworks. And the one that's kind of, in addition to the regulatory drivers that are coming out, the one that's kind of standing out is the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB. So they're developing a set of standards that are expected to replace many existing standards and kind of become the de facto set of harmonized ESG disclosure standards that are used globally. So I'd keep my eye on that one. A lot of the existing standards and frameworks are being incorporated into the ISSB, so they're not starting from scratch. And if you are aligning with existing frameworks, you'll be in a good spot to align with the ISSB. And so other than that one, I think as sort of like a future globally harmonized direction, I would say the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, is sort of the gold standard of ESG reporting. And then given the current climate crisis, there's a lot of increased emphasis on climate disclosure aligned with TCFD, which stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So that would be an important one, I would say. And then finally, the third, I mean, there's a lot of them, but the third kind of main one, I would say, is the SASB standards. So the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board has standards that provide material issues and disclosures for particular industries. So it's good to align with those if you're just for whatever industry that you're in.
Thank you.
Yeah, just the
Oh, sorry.
two more that I'd add to that would be from a carbon accounting perspective, the GHG protocol is definitely the gold standard there. And then from a trajectory perspective, when it comes to net zero, the SBTI framework has pretty much been well adopted and replaced a lot of the smaller ones. So particularly from a carbon perspective, those are the two I'd watch out for.
Yeah, and you know, just from our perspective, I would love for it to just have been one framework, but it just never worked out like that. We use GRI for our sustainability report, and we also include some SASB metrics in there that were identified in our industry leadership standard, our sustainability leadership standard. And then we also have been reporting to CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, since 2011. And that's now based around the TCFD framework, and they are looking to also align with ISSB. So we're seeing some consolidation, but I still envisage that I'll be using multiple frameworks going forward.
Thank you all. Next question we have is from Joy. Are we able to measure consumer response to ESG reports? Does it benefit companies in terms of sales?
I mean, the benefit that we see is, you know, improvements in our ESG ratings, inclusion in sustainability indices. So most recently, Investors Business Daily named us one of the best ESG companies, so mixing profitability with strong ESG performance. We were number 6 overall and number 1 in the energy sector, so very proud of that. That's one of the way we're able to measure that we're disclosing appropriately. But you know, I think our customer response to our approach to responsible solar and increasing sales as a result of that is really, you know, been the big driver. So the overall strategy.
There's definitely marketing benefits to it. There's no question that more and more consumer awareness around products is driving sustainable brands to rise to the top. But I think the other way to look at it is just a competitive advantage when it comes to supply chain. More and more, we're going to see that large companies will only be working with suppliers that are disclosing, and so you know, it's avoiding the disadvantage rather than just taking advantage of, you know, being the best out there.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And just it's probably specifically on your question about importance to customers and sales, that's probably more important at this point in time in B2B, more so than B2C, but you know, I think it's coming.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Please, attendees, post more questions if you have. I have one extra one, if you don't mind. Do you see what's the trend in having these reports assured, or it's like assurance, or just audited by a third party? And I know it's probably now it's more on the E side, but the entire report. What are your thoughts on this? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing this as a trend. So I think it's been common for a while for companies to have their greenhouse gas emissions data to be third-party verified. But verification of other data points in the report is becoming more commonplace. And then you can also get assurance for the entire report, which is separate than verification of specific data points. And we actually just did a benchmarking study for a client, and I was really surprised to see that all the peers that we benchmarked were assuring their reports. So I think that's been a big change in the last 2 years.
I definitely think, you know, in the European market, any carbon disclosures have to come from a verified, you know, carbon accountant. And so as we think about upcoming regulation, it's going to be more and more important to have and necessary to have somebody involved who is a certified carbon disclosure or is a software that's carbon certified. So we'll definitely, I think, you know, and also back to the greenwashing point, there's more and more scrutiny. So it's a better safe than sorry argument there as well.
Yeah, we've not had our sustainability report assured yet, but it is something, you know, that we're going to have to do. It is considered best practice. I think I've been a little skeptical about it in the past, just because I feel like not all assurance is created equal. Not all auditors are created equal. So, you know, some reports I've seen assured saying they've been developed in accordance with GRI, but they're not actually disclosing both absolute and intensity metrics. So I've had a fair bit of skepticism there, but it's absolutely coming. You know, look at the regulations in the US and in Europe, assurance will be required.
Thank you. We have one more question from Jake. Are there any best practices or generalized advice for a newly public company working on publishing their first ever ESG report?
I think if I can start with what goes into it, have a good foundation of your emissions. Work with people who know what they're doing in that space, because it's a little bit of the Wild West, and having expertise on the ground will make sure that whatever is going into your report has that accuracy and you have confidence in that data as well.
Yeah, and from my side, I would recommend, you know, understanding the framework that you want to use. So reading what you need to report, how to report. And also, you know, I know someone mentioned it earlier, don't try to report everything, really focus on what's material for your company. And, you know, maybe start small, like, you know, start publishing a few metrics on an annual basis and build up to a report. That was something we actually did in the early years, publishing some sustainability metrics on our website before we moved into the report world.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I would just add, I think it's really important, if you haven't been through this process before, to just really make sure that you're just stating the facts and don't say anything that you can't back up with evidence. Don't overstate things. You'll build up more trust with your stakeholders if you're genuine. I think a lot of folks internal within your company might have hesitations about telling the full story. But I think if you don't only talk about positive information, and fall into the trap of making ESG reporting a marketing only endeavor, if you kind of take your audience on the journey with you and just be very transparent, that seems to go over really well. So I would just take that attitude going forward.
And just to add one more thing, I think it's also very important that your ESG report is in parallel with your ESG strategy. So really walking the talk is what differentiates a good ESG report from a bad one.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more questions in the chat. So.
Thank you. Great discussion, everyone. I really appreciate the insights. I know this will be an evolving conversation, but with that, I'd be happy to hand it back to Julie to talk about some upcoming events. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate it. And we had a good time here. At least I did.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Oh, that was so great. Thank you. I just felt like I had a really good full meal, and I can't wait actually for for us to have a reunion next year to see where everyone is with their ESG reporting, because we know things are happening so quickly, and it's, what do they say, you're building the airplane while you're flying it. So yes, special thanks to Karen, Lauren, and Hasitha. Very much. We can probably advance the slides, and just a thank you also to everyone who works behind the scenes for several months to make sure that each and every event comes to us at least once a month. Joey is really critical. You saw her up on our screen. Of course, to Miriam, Oakley, Kirpa, Serena, Raphael, and Anka, thank you. And of course, we're always welcoming new volunteers into the group. So if it's something that you're interested in, whether you're just curious about the organization, or you're looking to build up your resume, or even try out a new skill, we'd love to chat with you. So go ahead, you can advance. And then just a reminder about the December 1st book club, which actually sounds really interesting. The holiday event in the middle of December, and the entrepreneur circle starting up in January. We usually have these kinds of events on Thursdays at 5 p.m. Pacific, and there are panels and workshops that happen roughly every month. And of course, we have a newsletter. So there's all kinds of different benefits and all kinds of different activities. And like I mentioned, we're going to be looking forward to some more in-person activities as our programming develops for 2023. So I think you can advance. There's one or two more messages here. Obviously, we're all over social media, so be sure to follow us in your favorite social channels. So thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday. And in case there's anything else I need to add, we can advance screens, but I think we're all free to go and enjoy the holiday.